Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Day Wall Street Exploded, a story of America in its first age of terror, by Beverly Gage. Narrated by Pam Ward. Introduction. At the corner of Wall and Broad Streets in Lower Manhattan, there is a memorial to the victims of terrorism. It is easy to miss, just a dozen or so pockmarks along the north face of the old Morgan Bank. The building has no plaque, no statue, no list of names. Only a tourist sign around the corner, set off from the bank's ornate front entrance, gives any mention of the terrorist attack that occurred here on a cloudy day almost 9 decades ago. On September 16th, 1920, as the bells of Trinity Church chimed the noon hour, a bomb planted on a horse-drawn wagon exploded into the lunchtime crowd at Wall and Broad, shattering windows throughout the financial district, killing 38 people, and wounding hundreds more. Until the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, it was the worst act of terrorism in American history. Erupting at the heart of financial capitalism, the Wall Street explosion inspired thousands of pages of anguished press coverage, much of it speculating about who had done what and why. The official investigation emerged as a 3-year global epic involving no less than a dozen government agencies and extending into Russia, Italy, and Poland. The Wall Street case ultimately shaped some of the key political trials of the 1920s, including the prosecution of Italian anarchists Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. It reached as well into the lives of some of the most controversial figures in American politics: the embattled Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, architect of the Palmer raids; J. Edgar Hoover, the youthful head of the Justice Department's new Radical Division; the legendary bankers of J.P. Morgan and Company, the nation's most influential financial institution. Most of all, it cast a national spotlight on the hundreds of communists, anarchists, socialists, and militant unionists who had endured World War I and the post-war Red Scare, only to find themselves accused once again of plotting violence and treason. How many such persons this makes we are unable to say offhand, the Evening Post remarked, as the investigation drew to a close at mid-decade. But at the present rate they will be numerous enough to justify a special section of the census of 1930. The Wall Street explosion struck at a moment when millions of people around the globe believed that capitalism was on the verge of collapse, or at least of profound transformation. The immediate impetus for this belief was the Bolshevik Revolution, which had emerged from World War I as a shocking example of how easily the old order could be replaced by the new. Even within the United States, where, as Lenin himself admitted, revolution would probably not come soon, the conditions spawned by industrial capitalism and by Wall Street itself had long been the subject of conflict and debate. The decades before the explosion witnessed the development of the great industrial corporation, the creation of vast new capital fortunes, the invention of the telephone and the electric light, and, not least, the rise of Wall Street as a financial and political power. They were nonetheless years of profound discontent, in which many Americans began to decry the economic system as a perversion of justice, run for the benefit of the few. Out of this clash came some of the great reform movements of American history, including the populist insurgency of the 1890s and the progressive drive of the 1900s and 1910s. These years saw the rise of smaller but far more militant groups as well, socialists, anarchists, and other revolutionaries, dedicated not to the reform of capitalism but to its abolition. Finally, they yielded a series of violent conflicts between employers and a growing union movement, what many described as a civil war between capital and labor. It was in this context that Americans first came face to face with the specter of revolutionary terrorism. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, newspapers were filled with reports of violent attacks on the symbols of American government and business, bombs mailed to mayors and governors, assassination attempts on presidents and capitalists, dynamite found beneath railroad tracks or outside the factory door. In the years before the Wall Street explosion, such violence was a central preoccupation of American politics and culture, the stuff of blaring headlines and fierce editorials, of congressional debate and soapbox oratory. Then, as now, the word terrorism conjured up images of clandestine plots, revolutionary zealots, and bombs planted to achieve the maximum psychological and political effect. Those images, in turn, helped to inspire a dizzying array of new laws aimed at containing radical and labor movements, from local ordinances against revolutionary speech to more sweeping federal restrictions on immigration and political dissent. This crackdown came to a peak in the Red Scare of 1919 and early 1920, when the federal government, led by Attorney General Palmer, deported hundreds of immigrant radicals on suspicion of advocating force and violence against the American government. 9 months after the final round of deportation raids, the Wall Street explosion erupted. Americans recognized the explosion as a shocking event, an act of diabolism unparalleled in the annals of terrorism, in the words of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. At the same time, they saw the bombing as something predictable, even inevitable. It is not surprising that the bomb massacre was accomplished in New York, noted the Washington Post. Rather, it would have been surprising if this festering sore had not come to its horrid head. To the Post, and many others, the explosion seemed to be the culmination of a half-century's worth of bitter political conflicts over the growing power of Wall Street, the rights of political radicals in the United States, the problems of political violence and terrorism, and the nature of industrial capitalism itself. In an instant, the explosion seemed to capture all of these disputes and send them hurling forth in a hail of metal and flesh and fire. It took the popular political metaphor of an attack on capitalism and made it real. I began researching the Wall Street explosion in the late 1990s as a graduate student living in New York City. What attracted me to the subject then was the strangeness of the society it seemed to evoke. Nothing in my experience gave me an immediate understanding of why Americans would have been so accustomed to this sort of violence in 1920. It also seemed incredible that an event of such proportions, with dozens killed and hundreds injured at the hub of New York's financial district, had earned no more than a sentence or occasionally a few pages in the vast literature on American history. I set out to write a book that would describe a distant world in which terrorism would be considered not surprising. Then came September 11th. Even now, with the war on terror at the forefront of national politics, this remains a book about the past, not the present. And yet to dwell on the differences between the two is to avoid the obvious. What makes the Wall Street explosion such an intriguing event is, at least in part, the way in which it reflects our own experience. There are the coincidences of time and place. Here's another attack in downtown New York in mid-September. And there are other resonances to be drawn out as well. Terrorism is not a form of violence restricted to one time or place. It has a history. As an abstract concept, terrorism has never been easy to define. Its basic elements are clear. Terrorism is a form of political violence designed to induce fear, and thus destabilize the social order. But the task of coming up with more specific boundaries and limits has befuddled social scientists for decades. Historians have had little better luck in reaching a consensus about when terrorism first entered the world stage. Walter Laqueur has traced the idea as far back as the zealots of the ancient world, who hid swords beneath their cloaks in order to commit clandestine political attacks. The word itself seems to date from the reaction against the French Revolution, when Edmund Burke, among others, denounced the Jacobins as hellhounds called terrorists. In the United States, terrorism appears to enter common usage as a political epithet sometime in the first half of the 19th century, applied variously to the actions of slaveholders, abolitionists, labor unions, employers, and all stripes of politician. Arriving at a definitive conclusion about either the origins or definition of terrorism is beyond the scope of this book. What does seem clear is that terrorism as both a theory and a practice underwent a profound change beginning in the late 19th century. The invention of dynamite in 1866 transformed an individual's ability to create mass destruction and wreak havoc from afar. In tandem with this breakthrough came the spread of new ideologies calling for the overthrow of industrial capitalism and its replacement by a more egalitarian, utopian order. As the two came together in theories of clandestine political violence, terrorism began to lose some of its more general connotations, emerging by the early 20th century as a tactic associated primarily, though not exclusively, with the revolutionary left. The European anarchist movement issued some of the first explicit calls for theatrical acts of violence to combat the power of capital. In the United States, trade unions and revolutionary groups debated the merits of such tactics in newspapers and open-air rallies, as well as during strikes and sensational public trials. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the iconic figures of the American left, anarchists Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman, labor leader Big Bill Haywood, and socialist champion Eugene Debs, argued frankly over the usefulness of violence and terrorism. They rarely came to a consensus on the matter. Nonetheless, they agreed, in ways shocking to 21st century ears, that its merits were well worth discussing. In an age when some 35,000 American workers died each year in industrial accidents, in which policemen and soldiers routinely fired on strikers and picketers, it was not unusual to hear the use of dynamite praised as a justifiable reaction to capitalist tyranny and a weapon of working-class self-defense. And that talk did, at least on occasion, translate into action. By 1920, most Americans hearing of the Wall Street explosion could recall a long list of bloody incidents, from the Haymarket Affair of 1886 to the nationwide dynamite attacks of June 2, 1919, in which opponents of capitalism, or at least of the Wall Street Money Trust, stood accused of employing bombing and assassination to achieve their ends. Some of the most dramatic incidents were targeted attacks on plutocrats or political leaders, rather than acts of mass casualty terror. Often the details of who had done what remained murky. All, however, contributed to the widespread impression that dynamite and assassination were a vital part of American class relations, as much a part of the new industrial age as electricity, financial trusts, and skyscrapers of steel. This is not to suggest that the American left or the labor movement as a whole supported terrorism, or, for that matter, violence of any sort during these years. If anything, talk became deed with remarkable infrequency, and even the talk itself was rarely as bloodthirsty or vitriolic as critics liked to suggest. One of the tricky aspects of writing about bombings and assassination is that they tend to reinforce stereotypes of wild-eyed anarchist bomb throwers, of brutal labor thugs that were themselves the products of controversy and manipulation in their day. Accusations about terrorism and bomb throwing served a variety of political agendas. Employers hoping to win public sympathy accused striking workers of fomenting violence and terror. Politicians used the specter of mass terrorism to whip up support for causes ranging from immigration restriction to their own political careers. The absurdity of some of these accusations, in turn, led to a culture of conspiracy on the left in which the first response of those sympathetic to labor and radical movements was to deny any possibility of individual guilt. The truth, however, is more nuanced than that. There were bombs, and those who believed in bombs, and there were also scapegoating, stereotyping, and false accusation. The question, in 1920 as today, is how to distinguish between the two. As the historian Richard Hofstadter noted in 1970, Americans have a remarkable lack of memory when it comes to violence. When he wrote those words, Hofstadter was responding to a generation of American historians for whom the notion of consensus, of a bounded and inescapable liberalism, seemed to be the defining feature of American politics. In the years since, historians have, by and large, rejected this romantic view, emphasizing the depth of conflict and real ideological dispute that went into crafting the American political tradition. But there remains a tendency to think of violence as an anomaly, something outside the American experience, rather than as one of the many ways that Americans have long carried out their political disputes. Few things testify to this phenomenon more eloquently than the declarations since 2001 that terrorism is something utterly new in the American experience, a horror without a past. There are many reasons for this kind of historical forgetting. As Hofstadter pointed out, there is something inherently difficult about assessing the role of violence in history. It is committed by isolated individuals, by small groups, and by large mobs. It is directed against individuals and crowds alike. It is undertaken for a variety of purposes, and in a variety of ways. Certainly this is true of the labor and radical violence that is the subject of this book. In its range of forms and motives, its parades of charge and countercharge, it seems almost to resist analysis, to be a string of individual acts with little in common other than the possibility of bloodshed and death. And yet, our comforting amnesia on this subject is also relatively recent. As late as the early 1930s, the significance of class violence in shaping the nation's economic and political development seemed self-evident to many observers. To me, the social critic Louis Adamic wrote in his 1931 book, Dynamite, it appears to be an inevitable result of the chaotic, brutalizing conditions in American industry, a phase of the dynamic drive of economic evolution in the United States. Adamic's book was the first major work to survey the use of violence, and especially terrorism, by the have-nots against the haves. It was also the last. Within a few years, as federal legislation reduced the level of violence in labor conflicts, the issue of bombings and assassinations began to lose some of its currency. By the 1950s, it had become politically dangerous, a brush with which to tar an increasingly beleaguered American left. Horrified at the excesses of McCarthyism, many liberal historians, Hofstadter included, went out of their way during the post-war years to minimize past controversies over violence, terrorism, and class conflict. They tended to depict the first Red Scare as an anomalous episode, the result of paranoid delusions, not genuine social conflict. In this context, the great bomb cases of earlier decades began to be understood as cautionary tales about McCarthyism, more important for the hysteria and repression they produced than for the tensions they revealed. In the late 1960s, historians of anarchism began to rediscover the world of militant revolutionary violence. For the most part, however, the issue has remained marginal, a matter of concern primarily for those interested in the factional disputes of the American left. While recent years have seen a handful of histories exploring some of the era's great bombing and assassination trials, broader questions about the impact of such violence on American society have received little attention. Many of the social historians who transformed the study of American radicalism and labor in the 1960s understood their task as a redemptive one, an effort to move beyond tired images of bomb throwers and dangerous subversives. They emphasized the unequal nature of class violence, in which strikers and protesters were often no match for policemen, soldiers, and guards. And they were admirably sensitive to the ability of those in power to channel public fear into campaigns of repression. In the process, however, they robbed at least a few revolutionaries of their militancy, of the idea that when they spoke of dynamite and armed resistance, they sometimes meant what they said. One goal of this book is to rediscover the genuine drama of class conflict in the United States, a story in which violence ran in at least two directions. From our current vantage point, it can be tempting to view the early years of the 20th century as a time of gradual progress, in which Americans, shocked by the inequities and indignities of their new industrial society, set out to find better ways to ensure basic democratic and economic rights. History is less kind than that. Far from being an era of placid reform, the turn of the century was a moment in which the entire structure of American institutions, from the government to the economy, seemed to be up for grabs, poised to be reshaped by new movements and ideas. To the degree that terrorism stoked this sense of disorder, providing a dramatic example of destruction and class vengeance, it was a remarkably effective political tool. Indeed, for the handful of men and women who undertook the task of setting bombs and planning attacks, this was precisely the goal: to illustrate the depravity of American industrial conditions and to put the society's leaders on notice that they, too, would suffer. Whatever the judgments of history, there can be no question that many Americans at the time took this threat seriously, believing that the nation was poised on the brink of chaos and revolution. This sense of crisis may help to explain why the history of revolutionary and labor terrorism has so effectively disappeared from national memory. Despite our recent financial turmoil, the institutions that were so bitterly contested in the Gilded Age and Progressive era, banks, corporations, factories, trusts, remain such an accepted part of the American landscape that it can be hard to imagine a time in which they were subject to revolutionary denunciation and to frequent violent attack. This is particularly true of the post-Cold War world, when those who fought the tide of capitalism, who threw bombs and organized strikes, can sometimes seem like hopeless offshoots, deluded in their dreams of reversing the course of history. Americans in 1920 did not have this benefit of hindsight. On September 16th, as they gazed into the rubble on Wall Street, as they read in the papers of an enormous and mysterious explosion at the hub of American capitalism, they did not yet know what lay ahead. Part 1. September 16th, 1920. Chapter 1. The Middle of Things. Junius Spencer Morgan never seemed quite at home on Wall Street. He wanted to be a marine architect. He was happiest on the water, racing yachts. But he was the eldest son of J.P. Morgan, grandson of the legendary J. Pierpont Morgan, namesake to Pierpont's father, the great gentleman banker Junius Spencer Morgan. So each day he went to work at the family bank. Thursday, September 16th, 1920, was no exception. The morning dawned cool and damp. New York papers were predicting rain. Junius' destination on that morning, as on so many others, was an elegant little building on the southeast corner of Wall and Broad Streets. There was no sign at the building's entrance. Everyone who conducted business in the financial district knew about 23 Wall. It was the headquarters of J.P. Morgan and Company, the nation's most powerful bank, and, to Junius, the family business. From an early age, Junius had been schooled in the commercial and personal values appropriate to a Morgan banking heir. He had learned that business was best conducted among a small and trustworthy elite, that a letter of credit from the proper source was worth more than cash. A banker was expected to be a man of great respectability, well-bred, well-spoken, decidedly Protestant. Earnings were not to be flaunted and spent. Rather, they were to be harvested and tended, like saplings destined to become great trees. The bank's headquarters reflected this Morgan blend of understatement and confidence, in contrast to the showy skyscrapers that had sprung up around the neighborhood in recent years. The bank stood just 4 stories tall. Those 4 stories were made from the finest materials, however, including marble from a Tennessee quarry purchased in its entirety. Within the cloistered world of New York banking, Junius was known as a likable fellow. He was shy, handsome, even something of a Democrat. Mostly he had done the expected thing: private school at Groton, then Harvard, then marriage to a suitable girl and a post with a bank. Along the way, in keeping with his family's philanthropic tradition, he offered symbolic gestures of humility. At Harvard, he avoided the hangouts of the rich boys, choosing to live among the working students on a modest budget. After graduating in 1914, he volunteered at a French military hospital. When he left, he donated 2 motor cars and artificial limbs. Now a newly minted partner in the world's most prominent bank, he was noted for his unassuming ways. Traveling to Wall Street from Long Island, he sometimes took one of the Morgan yachts. At other times, though, he rode the train, and to the delight of the society reporters, he often sat in the day coach. No matter how Junius arrived on Wall Street, once there he found it impossible to avoid at least a moment's contact with the city's workaday elements. The streets of the financial district swarmed with messenger boys, curb brokers, pushcart vendors, men for whom finance capitalism was a physical ordeal. Their running and shouting and aggressive elbowing had no place inside the house of Morgan, where business was conducted in hushed tones amidst brass and warm, dark wood. But given the bank's location in the geographic heart of American capitalism, given its awesome financial reputation, there was no way for a Morgan partner to entirely escape from the outside world. As Junius's father had recently boasted to a French colleague, the Morgan Bank stands, as it always has stood, in the middle of things. When he wrote those words, J.P., or Jack, Morgan, was celebrating the bank's success in the Great War, a cataclysm that at first had looked as if it might bring the financial world to ruin. From its founding in the 1870s, J.P. Morgan and Company, or as it was more imperiously known, the House of Morgan, was a matchless force in American economic life, a leading symbol, in the admiring words of the New York Sun, of the heroic age in American industrial history. By the turn of the century, it had moved from engineering loose financial trusts to creating corporate behemoths, International Harvester, U.S. Steel, whose size and heft reshaped the industrial world. Along the way, the Morgan Bank found itself on the winning side of countless national and international dramas: the railroad wars of the Gilded Age, William McKinley's campaign to defeat William Jennings Bryan and preserve the gold standard, the Panic of 1907, when the bank rallied Wall Street financiers to save the country from financial disaster. The Great War was only the latest crisis to be weathered and exploited, and there, too, the firm triumphed. The House of Morgan entered the war a mere cousin to the great London banks. It left as the undisputed leader of global finance. On September 16th, Junius was walking into the most significant institution of its kind in the world. This story of inexorable upward ascendancy, of vast power handled in gentlemanly fashion, was only part of the legacy that had been bequeathed to him, however. The rise of industrial capitalism and of banks such as Morgan, National City, and Kuhn Loeb was not a seamless democratic process. inspired by the precepts of John Locke and Adam Smith. It had been a bitter contest, sometimes literally.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?